All right, I think we are recording, so please be aware if you object to having your voice or video recorded, please turn those off. And in the meantime, I really want to thank you, Alexandre, for coming to talk to us about WinUI and the Community Toolkit. I will stand back and let you take it from here, if that's all right.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jim.
Right.
So, well, this presentation is about what WinUI 3 is and how the Windows Community Toolkit Preview, because we do have a version of the Community Toolkit that supports WinUI 3, and how that comes together and forms this new world of native Windows desktop development. So the first thing we'll have to understand is what exactly is WinUI 3, because in terms of a concept, it's not as simple as, oh, it's just a UI framework. There's a whole evolution of how it came to be. So we'll have to go back in time a little bit to understand how things actually come together. So at the beginning, we had MFC in 1992, where you developed using native C++. It stands for the Microsoft Foundation class library. And back then, the Windows version was Windows 3.1. That's a pretty old version of Windows. There was no .NET, no WPF, nothing else. But that was the state of the art of development for native UIs for Windows. In 2002, .NET came to be. And of course, we with it, and it was, but by then, the state-of-the-art framework for development. But the thing is, you couldn't just replace anything that you developed with MFC, even though you had 10 years of legacy software. That actually is not that much of a legacy, but the language was completely different. It was C# and VB.NET. You couldn't just port over your native C++ code to WinForms, so you actually had two state-of-the-art frameworks. They were both maintained, and they're both still being maintained for a long time. 4 years later, we had WPF, also on top of .NET. But of course, the tooling that we have for WinForms couldn't be easily converted to WPF. And again, that was the third state-of-the-art framework that we had. Not long after, 6 years later, we shipped UWP XAML in 2012, and then we actually supported both languages. We supported both C++ and .NET languages. Okay, now that solved everything. Now we have everything running. We have only one state-of-the-art framework. No, now we had a third framework, because even though it had the latest graphical engine, embodied the Fluent system, much better for support for touch and new device and form factors, it was still splitting the whole world in these two different paradigms called UWP apps and desktop Win32 apps. So even though it supported two languages, you couldn't just port all that code over, because you literally had two different, completely distinct worlds: the completely managed world inside your package, and the completely Win32 land of the free, do whatever you want Win32 applications. So that is currently the state-of-the-art frameworks that we have. We have 4 state-of-the-art UI frameworks, and one of them is about to turn 30 years old. And yes, we do support them all. So it's a very complex ecosystem, and we can't just abandon WinForms, WPF, MFC, or even UWP XAML because of all the legacy apps that we have that are running currently, and we don't want to let those developers out. So in order to try to solve that problem, we did introduce one thing called WinUI 2. So it was the first step in trying to converge those two models, right? So through a thing called XAML Islands, you could leverage your universal Windows platform UI inside a Win32 application. That's what XAML Islands provided to you. WinUI 2 actually is just a bunch of controls and styles that build on top of the OS XAML framework, but it ships as a NuGet package. So instead of having to wait for your customers to upgrade the OS, you're actually bundling parts of the UI framework. That's what WinUI 2 was, parts of the UI framework as a NuGet package. But it was only for controls and styles. WinUI 3, on the other hand, is lifting everything. All the UI stack is being lifted, right? So the entire code base of UWP XAML, all WinUI 2 controls and styles, the Windows 10 visual layer, all into a single UI framework and completely unbundled, decoupled from the OS. So it ships independently of the operating systems, just like WinUI 2 does today. And most important, it works everywhere on Win32 and on UWP applications. The first component, the WinUI 3 is the first component of this new project that we have at Microsoft called Project Reunion, which I will briefly later today. But you have to imagine that with WinUI 3, you can develop your UI with one shared language, which is UWP XAML. It's pretty much the same as UWP XAML, but deploy it for Win32 applications, UWP applications, and you can write it, of course, with C++ or C#. It will always contain the latest and greatest fluent controls and styles. It does provide the best user experience on Windows. The native UI performance in any application, as I mentioned, C++ or C#, supports .NET 5 and the latest versions of C# and .NET. So today, if you try to develop a UWP app, you are actually limited by .NET Standard 2.0. So you don't have all the latest and greatest APIs, even from .NET Core 3. You don't have all those new APIs in a UWP applications. You're limited in your support for nullables. But with WinUI 3, you'll be able to leverage all those in your .NET 5 applications. And of course, you decide when you want to upgrade. For Win32 developers, you have to imagine this as a new option to develop your modern applications, but much more familiar to you. One example is that the WinUI 3 desktop application is just creating a window, which is a simple HWind, which it's then drawing into, just like XAML Islands does. It actually uses pretty much the same implementation internally. So if you want to call a Win32 API, like set Windows pause, and to move it around the screen, you can. It should literally just work. It is a Win32 application. For UWP applications, it's pretty much the next version of UWP XAML, but every developer will be able to use it. We also will provide an analyzer and VS code fixes to help you migrate your existing code to WinUI, since the namespaces are changing. I'll go through the migration steps a little bit further, but mostly what you have to do is rename from windows.ui.xaml to microsoft.ui.xaml. That's pretty much what you have to do. In terms of a roadmap, and again, WinUI 3 is still in preview. The latest version is preview 2. The roadmap keeps updating, right? I did pick this one up from the WinUI GitHub page today. The WinUI 3 preview 3 should be released in about a month in November. But we did ship many different versions. The very first one was a little bit over a year ago, or around a year ago, at Ignite 2019. So we shipped Alpha 1. We also shipped Alpha 2 in February. Actually, Alpha 2 was just a few weeks later, just a stability update. That alpha version also included the WebView 2. So if you want to leverage the WebView 2, which uses the new Chromium-based WebView, which has a much more updated rendering engine, you have to use WinUI 3 as well. WinUI 3 Preview 1, which we shipped back at Build this year, May 2020, was the first preview that supported desktop applications, Win32 applications, as well as UWP applications. By somewhere in the beginning of next year, we will also open source WinUI 3, and that's a very important milestone. So not only we are undocking the whole UI framework from the operating system, which is one of the biggest parts of Windows, to be honest, we are open sourcing all of that. It's all C++ code. We does have some C# code, but it is being open sourced during the next year, probably the first semester of next year. And sometime in 2021, we'll have a stable version. And again, Preview 3 is not going to be the last version, which will ship next month. We'll have new versions coming out constantly, especially after we go open source. The cadence of updates and previews will update a lot. And of course, WinUI 3 itself, the final version in 2021, is not going to be the final version. We'll still have 3.1, 3.2. There's a lot of stuff that are still not supported. Just as one example, Xbox support. You can't build today an application with WinUI 3 in any of the previews. It still doesn't support Xbox development. In the future, we don't know yet if it's going to be 3.1, 3.2, but we do want and we will support Xbox development in the future. So it's literally just the very first step. So what is the Windows Community Toolkit? If you've never heard, just go to aka.ms/WCT, Windows Community Toolkit. But basically, it's a suite of controls, extensions, and helpers for Windows development. It supports ULP and .NET Standard, and it's part of the .NET Foundation. It's licensed under the MIT license. And just some stats. Over the 4 years since we shipped the very first release, we had over 25 releases. More now, it's these numbers are not completely updated. It's probably 1,400 by now, but we had about 1,400 issues closed, more than 5 million NuGet package downloads. With now we're almost at 10,500 commits and way more than 200 contributors. So it's a very open source, community-driven project with dozens of extensions, controls, and helpers that help you develop your Windows application. Of course, some of our packages are .NET Standard, so they do work if you want to use some of our high-performance extensions, which is something new that we shipped on the 7.0 previews that we have, which will ship very soon. Those can also be used under Linux if you want to on .NET Core. That absolutely does work. But the focus is on the Windows side of stuff. So just as a comparison, what WinUI is and what the Windows Community Toolkit is, WinUI is directed by the platform. The Windows Community Toolkit is directed by partners and the community. So not only we contribute with, we have contributions from the community, we do have full-time employees at Microsoft that work with some specific partners to develop some some controls and helpers that we put inside the Windows Community Toolkit. Of course, if it makes sense to be shared broadly. WinUI is built with C++ WinRT, whereas the Windows Community Toolkit is fully C#. Now we remove the very last bits of C++ that we have. We did have some contributions in C++. Now everything is C#. WinUI has components that need a broad audience appeal, whereas the Windows Community Toolkit has many smaller helpers and components. Not necessarily they're all small. We do have some pretty big controls, but it's just a comparison between the two. For WinUI, you always need a complete spec before implementation, where on the Windows Community Toolkit, it's much more for rapid prototype and gather feedback. So we do make breaking changes to adapt and maintain. Actually, the 7.0 release, which will ship very soon, is actually deprecating and removing old code that we do have numbers that are not broadly used or are just not being maintained well from the community. So as one example, we had services that provided connection with the Facebook service that actually had a dependency on a package that was not being maintained anymore, and not many people were actually using it, so we actually deprecated that and removed from the toolkit. WinUI 3 doesn't do that. Traditionally, they have way fewer breaking changes. And of course, it's owned by Microsoft engineers, where the Windows Community Toolkit is owned by the .NET Foundation. If you want to get started to contribute, please just go to aka.ms/Windows Toolkit app. That actually brings you to the Microsoft Store to download our sample app. And that sample app is not just for consumption. You can actually live edit the XAML. We do have a Monaco editor inside the app. We can edit the XAML and see the live changes of every single control and helper and service that we have, which is actually quite cool. And I will show that later today. All right, so 6.1 shipped not long ago. I think about 2 months ago, we shipped 6.1. 7.0 release is definitely going to be within the next month. And the 8.0 release, I know it seems a little bit too far away, but 8.0 release is where the toolkit should take a WinUI 3 dependency somewhere in 2021, whenever WinUI 3 has full support for store deployment through MSIX and UDLP. So that might take a little bit longer. That might be under the .NET 6 timeframe. We don't know yet, but that's when the toolkit will completely halt any development of the built-in OS XAML and have a dependency only on WinUI 3. That will minimize our testing requirements across all the platform versions that we have, since, of course, we're not running under different versions of the source code. Everything is running on top of WinUI 3, so we don't actually have to test on older versions of Windows. Of course, we still do, and we do have automated tests to do that, but it's not something that is likely to break anything that we do anymore. You have to think that since we're shipping this as a NuGet package, you don't have to wait for your users to upgrade your OS. So let's say that there's a brand new option, a brand new property on the button control, and you do want to use that on your very shiny, very new app. Of course, you don't want to wait for your users to upgrade their OS for you to use that one property, and WinUI 3 gives you that option because you're bundling everything inside your app. You're not depending on an update of the OS. So actually, let's go for a quick demo of the Windows Community Toolkit in WinUI 3 Preview 2. There are some caveats. I am using a very specific version of .NET 5. So I think the font here might be too small, but this is a global.json file that's just specifying that I want to stick with Preview 5, with .NET 5 Preview 5. That's actually a very important step if we are using WinUI 3 Preview 2. Preview 3 will fix that in probably about a month, but since that's not public yet, I'm still using the Preview 5 version of .NET Core, of .NET 5. So what I'm going to do here is just drag over my VS 2019. Another very important aspect is that you cannot use, as of today, VS 2019 16.8 preview or even 16.6. You have to use 16.7. That's the only release of VS that supports WinUI 3 Preview 2. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a project, and I actually installed a Visix. So if you go to ak.ms/WinUI 3 and download the Visix, which is an extension to VS, it's actually going to give you a few templates when you create a new project inside VS. And the one that I'm interested in is this WinUI in desktop, because that's the demo that I'm going to build. It's going to be a full Win32 application running on top of this brand new UI framework. So what I'm going to build here is this blank app package. And that's actually a very important thing to notice. WinUI 3 is actually running bundled inside an MSIX. So it does have an app ID. And as of today, that's the only way to run a WinUI 3 application. It does need an app ID, so it does need to be bundled as an MSIX. In the future, we don't know exactly when yet, but we will support just double-clicking on an exe, so you don't need specifically an app ID. You can just run it freely from any Win32 applications without being inside the MSIX container. So I'm going to select this blank app and packaged app and package, which is actually going to build one solution with two projects. I'm just going to copy this path so I put it in the right place. Let's call this WinUI new app. And this is going to ask me for target version and minimum version. And well, in this case, it doesn't matter that much. I will actually set the minimum version to even something older, because that's the minimum version that WinUI 3 supports as of today, which is 1803 or 17134. That's the oldest version that WinUI 3 supports. And since I'm not going to call anything from a newer SDK that is outside of the WinUI, of the UI part of it, of the XAML namespace, I'm just going to use this one as my minimum version. So the moment I do that, you see that it built the project for me. And one important thing to notice is that we have two projects. Again, the second one is just the packaging project. It's just the MSIX that is pointing to my main project here, which is my new WinUI 3 project. Again, this is very straightforward. Let me just close this and increase the font size a little bit here. But as you can see, that's the full length of my CS proj. That's because this is the new style CS proj, the same one you have if you just run a .NET new console application. It's a very minimalistic Microsoft Net SDK, which is the SDK proj, which is much smaller. As you can see, it's mostly just pointing to this NuGet package called Microsoft.WinUI. It's just specifying the 3.0 preview 2 with a specific build date here. But that's mostly all that it's doing. It's selecting the target framework Net5, specifying the platform version of 18.3.62 and the min version of 17.134 that I specified on that template selection, and some other properties just to make it run properly with the runtime, with the proper runtimes. But that's mostly the same. Adding things like app.xaml, main window.xaml, that's actually a new concept that's pretty similar to the WPF one, but I'll get there. But if you just open the app.xaml, you see that it's just like any WP applications that you built before. You have your application class, you have resources, and this is also adding the XAML controls resources. If you ever used WinUI 2, you definitely added this one line, because when you add the WinUI 2 NuGet package, it actually asks you to do that. This template does that for you automatically. Again, this is just a point in time. This is because it's in this preview state. In the future, your application class, since it always will be based on WinUI, it will be cleaner. It will be just like this, just an application. But for the time being, we still need to specify the XAML controls resources. At these app.xaml.cs, you'll see that this is, again, just a Windows UI.xaml.application. And you can see that most of our namespaces, everything under Microsoft.UI, is actually everything that in this .UI is not from Windows. There's no Windows.UI anymore. There's the Microsoft.UI.xaml, Microsoft.UI.xaml.controls, etc., etc. So we literally moved those implementations from being inside the OS to being outside of the OS inside these NuGet package. We do have some tooling issues happening. So if you try to use like hot reload or live XAML edit, that's not going to work as of preview 2. Preview 3 has all those working. So it's actually a much more stable release coming in about a month for you. But one thing that is very different here is this on-launch event that is creating a window, which is this main window, which is being created right here, main window.xaml and main window.xaml.cs. We're just storing that variable here and calling this activate method. This is actually our Win32 window holding everything and is creating the HWin for us and drawing all that XAML content inside it. So that is what's holding our window. If you want to, you can create as many windows as you want, and each one is going to have its own HWin. Again, in terms of multi-threading, this is much easier than it was with UWP because all the windows will be running on the same thread. Of course, if you want to, you can span a new thread, a new dispatcher queue thread. We do have APIs to do that, but then you have to initialize the whole framework on top of that thread. It's a little bit more complex, but it's all running in the same thread, which makes things like binding work much easier if you have multiple windows. So let's actually go to this main window.xaml.cs. It's, of course, just calling this initialize component method, and it's calling the mybutton.content equals clicked. If you go to the XAML itself, there is a button called mybutton inside this window class, which is new. This is the new concept that we're introducing in WinUI 3, but it's mostly just creating a stack panel and putting the button in the middle. So if I run this, if I didn't forgot to do anything, it should build our application, pack it inside the MSIX package, install it in the system, and show this window for me. So if the gods of the demos are with me, this is actually going to work. Any second now. But as you can see, the development experience is pretty much the same as it was for UWP, and it's going to be much closer on Preview 3, mostly due to having IntelliSense working, which is not working right now. So it did actually build. It's starting to deploy. The deploy succeeded, and starting to attach the debugger. I don't need symbols. And any second now. I usually load all symbols. So as you can see, so it's a little bit slower. But as you can see, given by this icon here, this is actually a Win32 application, not a UWP application, but it does host all these content that is purely XAML. And as you can see, it's very responsive, just as UWP was, but running inside this Win32 shell. And if I click on this button, it's actually going to call that event handler, which is going to call the that method, which is changing the button text to be clicked and the button content to be clicked. But that's pretty much it. It's a very simple demo, right? Where does the Windows Community Toolkit fit in all this? Well, we did ship a preview of WinUI, of the toolkit that supports WinUI 3. Pretty much we did the changing of all our namespaces and, of course, of our dependencies. But the beauty starts when you open the toolkit sample app. So I do have the sample app right here. And this is the Windows Community Toolkit sample app, where you can search for anything. So let's say, oh, I want to use the carousel view. And this gives you, with just very few lines of XAML, you have a carousel where you can specify a item template, which in this case is just an image, and data for it, and it's literally just giving you that carousel. It's very straightforward and easy to play with the sample app. We have bunch of different controls here. One that I really like is the range selector. This is actually a very common pattern where you have not to select a minimum and a maximum. Let's say you have two different sliders. Why not merge them in two if they represent one range, right? So that's what we have with this range selector. And again, it's just like any other control. It's just prefixed by the namespace of the Microsoft Toolkit UDLP UI controls. And you can just use all those controls inside your UDLP application. In this case, just to be clear, this is a full UDLP application installed on the store. What if I want to use parts of this code? Let's say, which one do I know that works? The grid splitter, again, this is preview, so not everything is working. I know that the grid splitter works quite well. So if I copy the XAML that we have here, which is quite complex in terms of size, about 100 lines of XAML, that actually should just work inside UDLP XAML. But before I do that, I need to do one thing. I need to point and install that new version of the Windows Community Toolkit. And I'm going to do that by right-clicking on my project and clicking on Manage NuGet Packages. Of course, we're not shipping those in NuGet.org directly, right? Let me just do one quick thing here. Just want to make sure that I'm pointing to the Windows Community Toolkit MyGet. Perfect. So there's the Windows Community Toolkit MyGet here, which I did set up previously. It's just a different feed that you have to configure or use a NuGet.config file. All the instructions are in our GitHub page, so it's very straightforward to add this. But once you do that and you check this include pre-release, if you browse through everything that is inside this feed, you see that we have the Microsoft.toolkit.anything version 8 point something, right? In this case, we have preview 1 and preview 2 already shipped here inside our MyGet. We are in the process of moving this to either Azure DevOps or GitHub, because we do have NuGet feeds on those platforms as well. But as of today, it is inside the MyGet. So what I'm going to do is literally just click on the install button here for the UDLP UI controls, which is where I know that the grid splitter lives based on the namespace. Quite easy actually to know that. So if I just click on the install button, that is going to download every single dependency that we have. So I'll gladly accept the licenses, which is going to download the packages for me and install them inside my application. Actually, if I didn't forget anything, it's okay. So it did work. And I'll just delete this old code, which I'm not going to use anymore. Also going to delete this event handler, which I'm not going to use anymore as well. And now I feel quite confident that if I copy the source, it will work. Very first thing I want to do is copy the namespace. So I'll just copy this namespace here inside my controls. So one of the reasons we are shipping previews is because we want feedback. Of course, we don't know everything and we don't know how people are actually going to use this. So I just want to make clear that we do want feedback. So one of the feedbacks that just it's very straightforward is the window doesn't have a window.resource. That's really unfortunate. So instead of just doing this window.resources, it doesn't work. We don't have, not just because IntelliSense is not working, literally because this property doesn't exist. I can't do this, it just doesn't work. So I'll have to create a grid to use the grid.resources. Yeah, IntelliSense is not working. Resources, then I can close my grid here, close the grid.resources, and now I can add whatever I want inside the grid.resources and inside the grid itself. Of course, I could have added it just to the app.xaml inside the resources. That still exists and that still works. I just wanted to keep everything in one file just because. So I added the namespace already. let me get, instead of the pages resources, I'm going to copy these resources and put them inside the grid resources now. And I'm just going to copy this whole root grid that has all my beautiful UI. And I'm going to copy this and paste it here. And if I didn't forget anything, and again, if the goddamn demo are with me, and if I run this, build and run this, I should have exactly that same experience running inside a Win32 application. Of course, I forgot something. Oh yeah, it did a bad rename here. I didn't notice that before. Just a little checking. Yeah, this seems to be right. IntelliSense is not working on Preview 2. It is on Preview 3, so this is not going to be an issue with our next version. So now it's building. And let's see how that one goes. It seems to have succeeded fine. Now it's actually packaging it inside an MSIX. And it's almost done. Bundling all the files, all the pry files, resources, XPFs. And yeah, I don't know why I do verbose logs. All right, now it's installed it. I don't need symbols. And there we go. There you go. Now we have our WinUI 3 desktop application running on Win32, leveraging the Windows Community Toolkit. So literally, that exact same behavior is just working, but now inside a Win32 application. So of course, this is a very simple application, but there's absolutely nothing blocking me from porting, just as one example, the whole Windows Community Toolkit sample app to inside a big island, because that's pretty much what it is. I just don't have that running here, but there's absolutely nothing blocking me from doing that. I'm in a different branch, so I can't run that specifically right now, but it does work. I did actually port the whole sample app of the Windows Community Toolkit inside, running as a Win32 application on top of WinUI 3. So every single control that we have on the toolkit is just running inside Win32s, which is by itself very, very cool. So let me go back to the presentation. I do have more content to share, very specifically around the saga that was how we migrated the Windows Community Toolkit to WinUI 3. The toolkit is a big project. So it did take us a while to migrate everything, not only because when we started on day one, literally the very first day when WinUI 3 Alpha 1 was released at Microsoft Ignite, there you go, November 4th. So a little bit under a year ago, I was actually at Ignite in Orlando. And when I saw that, I was like, oh, that's nice. I absolutely have to do this. So we did all the initial work at Ignite. By the end of the week, I got most of it working. But again, it's that 80-20 rule. 80% of the work was done very, very quickly. That last 1% actually is still going on. We're still not done porting everything. And I'll go through why that was the case. But the moment that WinUI 3 shipped, the very first alpha, I thought, well, either I do the work and somebody else is going to review it, or somebody else is going to do the work and I'll have to review it. And I'm sorry, but I'm not actually sorry. That is how the PR looks as of today, as of this morning, actually. And I really think I did the right thing, because I do not want to review a 780 file PR. It was massive to do. I'll say that it's almost as massive and way more boring to review a PR as big as this. But to be completely clear, it wasn't a complex change. It was mostly files like this, where we literally just changed the windows.ui.xaml to microsoft.ui.xaml. 99% of the changes, 99% of all those files are just this. The other changes are within the project files themselves, the CSproj, target files, some things that are slightly different. But yes, there were some code changes that actually had to happen, mostly because some things are not exactly the same. So let's actually go through all of them. The very first one, just replace a thing that we called WUX to MUX, Windows UI.xaml to Microsoft UI.xaml. Pretty much replace all of them. Well, when I say all but not all, is because some things like color, as one example, the window.ui. I'm not, no, I forgot if it's under the XAML. I don't think it's under the XAML. So it's windows.ui.color, singular color, still lives in the windows.ui.color. It had not migrated to Microsoft.ui.color. And it actually makes sense. On the other hand, the plural class, which is just a static class, windows.ui.colors, which is pretty much acts like a big enum of colors. So if you do colors.red, that one actually migrated to the Microsoft.ui.xaml, actually Microsoft.ui.colors. So you have to be slightly careful. If you just do a big replace, it will probably cover 95% of the cases. You'll have to roll back some of the Microsoft back to Windows because some of them actually didn't move. But you have to think that you're migrating actually more than one thing. You're not only, if you did the same thing as I did, you're not only migrating from one namespace to another, from one framework to another. You're switching from something that was built into the OS to something that is actually coming from a NuGet package. You might also be moving from a UDLP execution context to a Win32 execution context. You might also be moving older APIs to newer APIs. One example is the XAML root. Whenever you have a UDLP application running, you actually have a concept of a core window. That core window doesn't exist on WinUI 3. Not when you're running inside a Win32 context. If you're running inside a UDLP context, you have the same context, the same concept, but not if you're running as a desktop app, as a Win32 app. So some APIs like window.current just doesn't exist. That API will return null, or maybe another one, and it's very likely that you're just doing window.current.something. That's actually going to throw a new reference exception when your code, especially if you're a library developer, if your code is running in the context of a desktop application. So you have to be very careful. One API that replaced that, and again, that's not a new concept, running Win32 things inside UDLP things inside Win32 context. We had that with XAML islands. So it's not a new API that we release or that we're going to release in the future. It's something that exists every release of Windows since we supported XAML islands. And that is RS5, which is where we have that XAML root class. So as one example is the message dialog. That class is pretty much deprecated. We don't want people using the message dialog anymore. That's a very old class from the Windows 8 era, but we don't want you to use that anymore. What you should be using is the content dialog. So this is one example of a message that we had on the sample app, in this case, on the printer helper, that was literally just saying printing done. Instead of calling the message dialog, you should be calling the content dialog. The big difference here, to make sure that this code works both inside a Win32 context as well as UDLP, you have to use the XAML root. So in this case, this was just a code renderer, which was a control. So it did have its own XAML root. So imagine that XAML root equals this .xaml root. So this literally just worked. So migrating from an old API to a new API might be required as well. So this windows.ui.popups namespace is not to be used anymore. Another example is most of the calls to anything.get for current view. That's a very common pattern. One that you probably use is like, if you're a Windows Phone developer, you probably use status bar.get for current view. That was literally getting the status bar that was associated with the XAML framework that was running in the running thread. That's the current view, because back when that API was created, you had a parity of one window for one thread. So get for current view was actually getting it for the current thread. It's a static method that has no parameter. How in hell is it going to know which one it was bound to? But when we moved to this concept of having islands of content, there was no way of knowing where the XAML framework was initiated. You could have literally multiple islands of content that were bound to the same h-wind that would maybe running in the same context, in the same thread. So it's slightly different to know, as one example, just coming back to the message dialog, where should the pop-up actually show, inside this island or inside this island? That's why it needs the XAML root. So the exact same thing exists for application view.get for current view, core application.get for current view, core window.get for current view. Those three first ones are the most used ones. But we do have equivalents on XAML root for every single one of these APIs. So if you want to get, as one example, display information, where you can get, let's say, DPI information for the current window you're running, literally for your monitor DPI resolution, you can use, and it will still work, display information.get for current view. But you have to be careful. That's going to work only on UWP. It's not going to work on Win32. So you have to use the XAML root equivalents. Another concept that changed a lot is the dispatcher. We always had a concept of a dispatcher that informed us how to run code specifically on the UI thread. That's what we call the dispatcher thread, or the UI thread. But, and again, it's not a new concept. It existed ever since we had XAML islands. But you should not be using the core dispatcher anymore. You should be using the dispatcher queue. That is exactly the same concept as we have today for dispatcher queue. Luckily, there is a new dependency object.dispatcher queue, and dependency object is inherited by UI element, geometry, style, resource dictionary, framework template, and many other classes inside the XAML framework. So if you just do this.dispatcher queue, if you're running not in your view models, if you're just running that in any control class, it's very likely that you will have access to an instance of a dispatcher queue. The core dispatcher still works, but it works only when you're running inside the context of a UWP application. If you use a dispatcher queue, it works on both. That's a new class that we developed specifically for this purpose. If you're running on a background thread, as one example, a view model where you don't actually have a strong reference to a UI element, you can just call the dispatcher queue.get for current thread. But of course, you can't run that line in a background execution thread. If you run that from the UI thread, it will return you the dispatcher queue associated with that specific UI thread. If it's not, it's just if you're running from a background thread, it will just return null. So you have to be careful. Some small adjustments to your code, especially if you're a library developer, need to be made. Another big difference is that UWP still uses .NET Native, and WinUI Desktop uses .NET 5, in this case, Preview 5. So a new concept needed to be made that actually translated all that code that was built in C++, because that's how UWP is built. The framework itself is built with C++, but it's completely transparent to developers, to C# developers, that it just exposes a C# authoring layer. The the new tool that was created for the same purpose that was literally built in the UWP compiler is this new tool called CS_WinRT. And that's a new open source tool. So it's completely open source. Just go to github.com/Microsoft/CS_WinRT. Stands for C# WinRT. It's this exact same concept. If you're a C++ developer and you ever used C++ WinRT, it's exactly the same thing, but it creates the bindings for C#. And it creates the projections of your WinMDs in C# files. So not only it creates the projections that's during build time, it also has a runtime to make sure that calling a method from one technology, let's say from C++ to C# or vice versa, just binds the parameters properly and handles all the life cycle of those objects properly. That was being done automatically by the compiler before. It's not the case anymore. You have this tool, just so you are aware. So if you're building an application, that probably doesn't matter. If you're authoring a library, that matters a lot. You have to provide the projections of your C++ library, as one example, through the CS_WinRT tool, so it can be consumed from any language. On the toolkit, we do have dependencies. We're not a singleton. We do have dependencies. As one example, we have the XAML behaviors SDK as a dependency. And I had to migrate and ship a new version. So if you look inside NuGet, that's actually on NuGet already. There's a new WinUI-based version of the XAML behaviors SDK. We also migrated the colorcode.uwp, and we created a colorcode.winui package. The one dependency that hasn't been migrated fully yet is Win2D. Just to be completely clear, is not that we're not doing the work. Actually, inside Microsoft, we have bits running around. It's just not in a stable place, so we don't fully support it. So we're not shipping those yet to the community. We really want it to be stable before we make a public commitment that we're going to support that. So it might take a while until you see a Win2D version of WinUI 3. Probably in the beginning of next year, sometime around next year. But since that's not public yet, the public code that we have on our NuGet, it's actually commenting out anything that touches Win2D. So you just have to be slightly careful if you're trying to use any of our effects or the eyedropper control. That's not going to work because it has a dependency on the on Win2D. We didn't want to completely remove those classes because the whole dependency tree could have just broken out, and some things have hard dependencies just on specific parts of a file that don't touch Win2D. So if we removed one class just because it touched Win2D once, then it would break a lot of stuff that didn't have to be broken. The downside of that is that if the eyedropper class is one example that has a dependency on Win2D is there, but it doesn't work. So you just have to be slightly careful on what you use. That's why you're a preview, and that's why we are on MyGet. We're not even going to publish our NuGets, your NuGet packages on NuGet.org just yet. For the sample app, we also had a couple other dependencies. The Monaco editor UWP version, which is maintained by Michael Hawker, that works on my team, is a co-worker with me. I migrated that to use the WebView 2 control as well, which is quite nice that you actually have exactly the same code just working on top of the WebView 2, which is now, we're not just changing the XAML engine, we're also changing the HTML, JavaScript, CSS engine from the old Edge to the new Chromium-based Edge. There's also the notification visualizer library, which is not open source, but we did create an internal version just so I can build the sample app properly of the Windows Community Toolkit. And of course, every single thing that I showed you is out in the open, right? So if you just go to github.com/windows-toolkit/Windows Community Toolkit and go to the WinUI branch, you can see every single thing that I did, every single tweak that I had to do. And it is all out in the open. Just some requirements. Remember, you have to use For preview 2, WinUI 3 preview 2, you have to use VS 2019 16.7. Anything preview 3 plus is fine. We're already on stable, right? You have to use .NET 5 preview 5. We did have some people opening issues on the toolkit saying that the preview for WinUI 3 that we ship doesn't work with .NET 5. It does. You just can't try to use preview 6 or release candidate 1 or release candidate 2 yet. It needs to be an exact match of preview 5. We know it's very tied in together right now. It's not going to be the case in the future when we RTM. So we already have RTM bits of daily builds of .NET 5. Of course, they're not the RTM version, but it's getting there very soon. I'm pretty sure we're shipping a stable version at .NET Conf. I think that's when we're shipping the RTM version of .NET 5. So somewhere around the same time frame, we should have a WinUI 3 Preview 3 version that is based on the RTM version of .NET 5 RTM. And that's going to work only with 16.8. You have to update VS as well. Things are very tied in together right now. But if you want to test Preview 2, just go to aka.ms/WinUI3/preview download the physics, install it in your VS 2019 16.7 version, create a project, and just try it out. If you want to try the toolkit, just add the Windows Community Toolkit MyGet feed into your VS installation, either in the tool itself or inside a NuGet.config file. And that's going to give you the option to download version 8 of the toolkit, where we do support WinUI 3. And that's pretty much all I had to say. Thank you very much. And let's go and open for questions.
Actually, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I had a question regarding Visual Studio. Does the Visual Studio Community Edition supporting this?
Yeah, absolutely. Any version of VS 2019.
So I was curious if you could tell us anything about any of the limitations. For example, are there any concerns with things like, if you're running WinUI on a Win32 application, are there any issues with things like DPI or
not as
composition?
Of today. We had problems. It only worked on 100% DPI. I think on Alpha 1 and Alpha 2. I think that by Preview 1, we fixed all those issues. So in terms of DPI, it's working just fine.
Okay.
Moving from one screen to another, that's just working. It should, cool. At least. If it's not, then it's a bug.
Right. That's okay. Cool. How about stuff like composition and stuff like that?
Should work absolutely just fine. If you want to use, we don't have yet a version of Lottie that supports WinUI 3, but I know that the team is working on it. But anything that
your audio may have just disappeared. Is that just me?
Oh no, I think it was me. Someone called me on my phone. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Composition should absolutely just work. You just have to be careful that we are undocking the UI layer. The UDLP as a concept, everything was just this one big thing called UDLP, but not everything is the UI layer. So if you try to call a Bluetooth API as one example, and that API exists only on the newer version of Windows, you still have to do adaptive code inside your application. You have to check if that API exists. If it's coming from the UI layer, if it's the WinUI part, anything Microsoft.UI, then you don't have to worry. You don't have to do any more conditional XAML. That's not required anymore because you're bundling everything inside your app.
Awesome. So as far as that goes, are there any? Because I recall that one of the cool things about things like composition was that it started to get a little bit closer to the hardware. Is that still the case, or?
Absolutely, yes. It's exactly the same. So it's actually even newer, right? It's the new version of composition. We're not doing any more updates to the UI layer on the Windows SDK that is built into the system. Every single new thing that we develop, we're building inside WinUI 3.
Fantastic. That's awesome. Thank you.
So I was under the impression this is cross-platform, and I think I saw earlier that this is going to be supporting in Android and iOS.
No, it's important to notice that even though we're supporting .NET Core, which is pretty much .NET 5, we are in the target framework .NET 5. So for Preview 3. On Preview 2, we still had a dependency on Preview 5 of .NET 5. On that version, we still didn't support the new TFMs, so the target framework for, monikers, based on the new pattern. So the old pattern was just .NET 5. A little bit before that, it was actually .NET Core 5.0. Now the TFM, the moniker is just .NET 5. On RTM, on the new versions, release candidate 2 that we have today, that moniker, if you want to specify something that is specific for Windows, you can. So you use the .NET 5-Windows 10.0. The version that you want to target as your minimum. So you have to be careful. That is not because it's under the .NET 5 that we don't have OS-specific code. WinUI 3 runs only on Windows 10, only on, if I'm not mistaken, RS4 Plus, which is 17.134.
Now, does that story get a little bit less clear with Uno Platform, or?
Uno Platform already supports WinUI. They did add support for Preview 1 and Preview 2. So yes, you can get your app and run it. If you build it on top of WinUI 3, you can port that code into Uno Platform and then run it on Android and iOS. But it's not WinUI that is supporting that. It's the Uno Platform.
Gotcha.
But you don't have to switch back to the windows.ui.xaml namespaces to do that. WinUI is supporting Uno Platform is supporting WinUI, so the code should be exactly the same.
Nice.
Which is nice, yeah.
Guys, so in the case of, for example, well, still talking on Android and iOS, is that the same case for Xamarin or eventually .NET MAUI support?
It's different. So the MAUI story is very different from Uno. So Uno actually builds on top of Xamarin when you're running on iOS and Android. But it's important to know the difference between Xamarin and Xamarin Forms. Xamarin Forms is a different flavor of XAML built on top of Xamarin Android and Xamarin iOS and UDLP, and it supports you writing your Xamarin Forms XAML application on top of those platforms. The Uno platform, on the other hand, supports the full set of UWP XAML, and in the future, they're already supporting WinUI 3 XAML, which is the same as UDLP, but UDLP XAML or WinUI 3 XAML on top of those platforms as well. But they don't use Xamarin Forms. They re-implemented Xamarin Forms, let's call it that, but in a much more complex way, because it supports web, it supports Linux. It's different. The implementation itself is different, and the XAML itself is different. So yes, Uno platform, you can write your application using WinUI 3 XAML. Then you can use Uno platform that is going to use Xamarin Android and Xamarin iOS to run that WinUI 3 code inside Android and iOS. But it's not using Xamarin Forms. Xamarin Forms is a different framework with a different flavor of XAML.
Right. So Xamarin Forms and MAUI are a different dialect of XAML and they
Yes.
don't really mix with WinUI and Uno platform.
Exactly. Maui should in the future. I don't think that's something that that they have fully working as of today, but I know that team is investigating supporting WinUI 3 for their Windows head. So you develop your Maui application once using the Maui framework, and that's going, which is pretty much the evolution of Xamarin Forms, right? And that's going to build on top of Xamarin Android, which now everything is just .NET 5. But let's say it's just Xamarin Android running on Android, Xamarin iOS running on iOS, and WinUI 3 running on Windows. WinUI 3 is the very lowest level of UI framework that you have, which is the UWP UI framework.
So which dialect do you think is going to win?
It's not a battle.
No,
it's not a war. Absolutely not a war. We don't want to build a framework to rule them all. That's not the goal. We want to build a framework that fulfills specific needs of specific developers. So if your developers, let's say that you are a manager and you don't know if you want to use Maui or WinUI or React Native, if your developers have a web background, there's no reason for you to try to teach them WinUI or Maui. Just go with React Native. They have a web background. It's much easier for them, right? It might be the better solution for you. So even React Native, we have a React Native for Windows implementation. We don't want people to use one single framework to rule them all. There is no such thing. Different developers have different backgrounds, and we want to support them all.
Very
Gotcha.
cool.
Makes sense. And still that for the case of other people coming from other backgrounds, in the case for MVVM, is that kind of the king still on WinUI 3, or is that like a new way for other patterns?
It's the same as UWP. The same as UWP. You have the same concepts of binding. You have the same XBind that you have on UWP that you didn't have on WPF, which is much more performance. Also, the Windows Community Toolkit has a brand new MVVM implementation on V7, which has already been ported because it's just .NET Standard, but has already been ported to our WinUI 3 version. So there's absolutely nothing blocking you from using this new MVVM framework from the Windows Community Toolkit on top of the Windows Community Toolkit version that supports WinUI 3. It's a lot of acronyms, so it's hard to follow up. MVVM is the way to go with WinUI 3.
All right, thank you.
Awesome, thank you.
Sure. Any other questions?
I do have one more if you have some space for questions. In the case of other things coming, yeah, it's not really from the things we already discussed, but this trend on having hot C#, hot reload, things like that, is that something that is on the land for this, or is that something that is eventually going to be supported?
Preview 3, which should ship soon, is already supporting that. We have internal bits, and that's already working.
Awesome.
It's not working on Preview 2, so if you try today on your machine, it's not going to work. On the very next version, it will work.
All right.
Any other questions? Give you ones.
All right. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, Jim.
It was really awesome for you to jump in and offer to do this, and very honored to have you here and share this with us. And I always love this kind of story and getting the word out about it, because there's a lot to it, a lot of details. I'm still wrapping my head around some of it and trying to figure out what the best use cases are in which circumstances, which ones are better for Maui, and which ones are going to be better for this story. And And there's still bits and pieces to figure out, but I tend to lean toward the WinUI side. I've been a UWP fan for a long enough time that I've got a little bit of code invested in it that I'd like to keep going too. So, and so like I say, definitely love hearing about what's going on and what's new with it. So thank you very much again.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
Just one other thing before we call it an evening here. I just wanted to put in a little bit of a plug for Code Camp here. And are there any other events or things going on that anybody wants to bring up before I show a little bit about that? All right, I won't belabor that too long here. I just figured I'd share the website real quick. I think that is this window. Yes. No, that's the wrong window. Pardon me a second. Let me just go the simpler route here. I'll just share my screen. All right, so, and of course I just closed it. So let me open this. And I just wanted to call this out. This is something that a lot of us here in this group, are working on putting together. Saturday, November 14th. The schedule is pretty amazing. We've got a huge sessions lined up for it. It's all going to be online. We've got a lot of stuff that we're putting into it to try to make it feel a little bit more like an in-person event than most online events. We're going to have the opportunity to be a little bit more interactive, not just with the presenters, but even with other attendees and stuff like that. We're playing around with a capture the flag challenge that's going along with it that we're going to be opening up sooner rather than later. And we are even trying to bridge the gap for things like event merchandise and stuff like that. So our plan for this here is we've got a store full of branded stuff that I can show real quick here, but idea is that we're going to be it's in here in the store at cost right now, but we're gonna try seeing if we can do prizes that give away this stuff too. So so lots of fun as far as that goes, and we're looking forward to it. That's going to be again November 14th. I think that's the week before we meet next. So this is the last .NET meetup before that Saturday, I think. So I just wanted to put in the mention for it. And if you're interested in going, definitely visit the website here, granitestatecodecamp.org, and hit the register now to get your ticket to make sure that you've got access to the capture the flag and the chat and that sort of stuff. So hope to see you there. And in the meantime, thank you for coming. And any questions before we call it a night?
No, thank you, Jim.
All right. Thanks again for you all coming, and really appreciate it. It was awesome. Great stuff, Alexander. Thanks again.
My pleasure.
Alexander.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you all for showing up. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Take care.